My name is Jessie. I'm a leadership trainer and speaker specializing in performance and well-being in the workplace. And you are here for part 2 of a 2-part leadership series called Strength in Differences to help leaders learn more about both neurodiversity and disability. So in our last video, we really honed in on neurodiversity specifically, and I ended by talking about the Venn diagram here, that sometimes there is crossover between these topics, and there are some distinctions. And so I wanted to hold some separate space to specifically get into disability in the workplace. And so I knew that I needed to call in an expert. So I have with me Sherry Salvatore. Sherry is a retired human resources leader who specializes in disability in the workplace. I also called her in because she happens to be my mother. So, hi, Mom.
Hey, sweetheart.
Thank you for joining me for this one. I just want to remind everybody for this series, it really is designed for you to watch this with other leaders. And so I would encourage you to get a group of people together. I'll also put an activity at the end that's really designed to foster some dialogue on this topic as well as neurodiversity. So that will be coming up. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to the basic vocabulary of what we're talking about today. So my first question for you is, what is disability?
Disability is anything that could be a mental or physical condition that has an impact of limiting a major life activity. And that could be breathing, moving, seeing, hearing, learning, anything like that.
Working, I assume.
Certainly.
Talk to me about the ADA.
So in 1990, the ADA was signed into law, and it was put into place to provide protection to people who have disabilities, and it protects them in all aspects of their public life. Maybe that includes employment, public transportation, public accommodations.
So we'll specifically hone in on the employment piece of this, but what I'm hearing is it's broader than just employment.
Right.
I'm curious to hear from you, what's the ultimate why behind this?
I think it's important to understand that we are looking at qualified candidates who can be successful in our organizations. They can contribute so much. And sometimes it's just a matter of a very simple accommodation that allows them to be successful in their job.
This law is helping get people to the table, and then once they're at the table, making sure that they have the basics that they need to do employment-related activities.
Yes.
So what are examples of employment-related activities that would show up in the realm of thinking about ADA?
Sure. It's not just about hiring people and placing them in a job. Now maybe you have training sessions, and you need to make sure that the training is designed to accommodate people with disabilities. Maybe you are having an office party at a local restaurant. Can this person attend and be part of the social atmosphere of the office? Sometimes you need to have a conversation about those sorts of things and find out, what do you need at a restaurant? You know, it's a respectful conversation.
Yeah, and it's something I assume most people leaders want to have. It's the type of environment they want to have, and yet there's so much fear around this because it is a legal issue as well. And that's exactly why I want to play a game that's called Fact or Fiction. For everybody who's watching, I would recommend that you hit pause as I read these cards out and see if you can answer this yourself. But I want to get into some of the curiosities that I hear floating around in the world of people leadership. So I'm going to read these cards to you, and then I want to hear from you as the expert. Is it fact or is it fiction? And then I'm really going to come at this from the mindset of being a people leader and just ask you the types of questions that managers tend to ask me when I work with them.
Okay,
let's get into this. The ADA only protects people with visible disabilities.
That would be incorrect. The ADA does protect people with visible disabilities, but it also protects people with invisible disabilities, people who are regarded as having a disability, and people who are associated with people who have a disability. Let's say that I have a spouse who is disabled, and I am up for a major promotion and I am very well qualified for it, but my employer passes me over because of my association to someone with a disability, and my employer thinks, oh, well, she will miss too much work because she has to care for her spouse. That would be discriminatory behavior based on my association to someone with a disability.
Okay. So for disabilities that aren't visible, how would a people manager even know that their employee has that disability?
So invisible disabilities are those that we can't see. So just by looking at someone, you wouldn't know if they had heart disease or cancer or mental health conditions. So during an interview, I think it's very important that you ask every candidate, are you able to perform the essential functions of this job with or without accommodation? And you ask that to everyone, not just to people who have a visible disability, but to everyone. And that way you're able to find out what is needed to make them successful in the job. They could also come to you and request an accommodation. Sometimes they will bring a medical document, right, to show that they have X, Y, or Z. That medical document is confidential. It cannot be discussed to anyone else at work, and it doesn't go in the employee's personnel file. It must be kept in a separate and locked medical cabinet so that anyone who has access to the employee's personnel file cannot see their medical information. And I would say even in the presence of that employee, you say, I'm going to go take this and I'm going to go put this in a locked file, just so you know. And oftentimes it's a great time to take a little break. You do that, you come back and say, okay, it's locked away, let's continue.
And so then that goes down a more formal process internally for...
It can be an informal conversation. It's interactive.
Okay.
And if that doesn't work, then it can go to a formal legal process called an accommodation hearing.
Okay. And hearing sounds like it, well, you said it's legal, but it has a feeling of almost like somebody's in the wrong. What's that actually like to go through that process?
So typically, an employee comes to the employer and requests an accommodation. Let's say I'm in a wheelchair, but my chair doesn't fit underneath my desk, okay? So I can't reach my computer to do my work. So I request an accommodation of a raised desk, okay? Maybe I want this fancy electronic desk that will raise and lower, but my employer suggests instead that they just simply put some blocks underneath the legs of the desk. Does the same thing. So it's an interactive conversation. We are hearing each other, right? We're talking to each other, we're listening to each other, and we're problem solving together so that I can be successful in my job. If that doesn't work, and we can't come to any type of an agreement, then it can go to a legal process, which is a formal hearing that takes place in a court.
So that's where the term reasonable accommodation comes up.
And for it to be reasonable, it cannot create an undue hardship on the employer. So it can't be too expensive or create a safety issue for other people.
Okay. The next question, and I've heard a lot of people talk about this, employers must hire anyone who has a disability.
No. An employer can and should hire the most qualified person for a job. And then you get into that question about what is qualified. And so I always suggested to the leaders that they make sure that they have current job descriptions that list accurately what's involved in doing a job. And then that job description gets sent out to the candidates prior to an interview. Then during the interview process, they are given the job description to review again, and the question is asked, can you perform the essential functions of this job with or without accommodation? If they can, they are qualified. Also, that means that they have met all of the qualifications. They have the knowledge, skills, abilities, licensures, whatever is required to do that job.
So if the person is not qualified based off of that and they have a disability, that's not...
They're not qualified. They're not a qualified candidate.
Okay. Next question. During a job interview, an employer can't ask a candidate if they have a disability.
They cannot ask a candidate if they have a disability. They can ask, Can you perform the essential functions of this job with or without accommodation?
So that language is really significant to get down.
Right.
Because they're not actually the same question.
No, you could not ask someone, do you have a disability? Maybe someone would only ask a question related to disabilities if they noticed that the candidate was visibly with disability. And that is a big mistake because, as we know, there are many forms of disability that are invisible. And so that same question should be asked to every candidate.
So it's being proactive and it's being consistent.
Yes, and it's being considerate. It gives the opportunity for a person to say, yes, thank you for asking, and here's what I would need. And it's usually something that's very simple.
Okay, so speaking of things that people may need, let's talk about service animals. Service animals, this is the question, fact or fiction, are required to wear a vest or have an ID tag to be recognized.
No, that is incorrect. Service animal is a tool that enables a person with a disability to function in their life. So if someone came to work with a service dog, there are only two things you could ask them. One would be, is that dog with you because of a disability? Or what task or work does that dog do? You cannot ask the dog to demonstrate. They're not a trick pony. You cannot ask the person, so what disability do you have that requires this dog to do that for you? You don't ask about the disability only if the dog is there because of a disability.
Okay, so we're going to talk about animals again. Emotional support animals are not considered service animals under the ADA. Is that fact or fiction?
It is true that emotional support animals are not considered service animals under the ADA. It is not a task or work that this animal has been trained to do in order to assist someone with a disability.
If it's an emotional support animal, could there be policies that say that that animal could not come with an employee?
At work, yes. Places that say no pets allowed, that does not apply to a service animal. Because again, a service animal is not a pet. That would be like saying no crutches, no wheelchairs allowed. Emotional support animals, there may be rules and regulations that allow them to be, say, in a housing facility, but not in the same way that you would see at work for a service dog.
Okay. Fact or fiction, employees with disabilities cannot be terminated under the ADA.
That would not be true. If you terminate an employee with a disability for a specific reason, that specific reason must also result in termination for employees who do not have a disability. So it's important that we consider that things are kept equal. However, typically before you get to the point where you have to terminate an employee, there have been disciplinary issues, right? It's a progressive process in most places of employment. I would strongly encourage leaders to ask the employee the very first time there's a rule infraction or the performance is declining, I would ask that employee, is there anything that we as your employer can do to help you? And I think by doing that, you are telling that employee that you want to problem solve with them. Maybe they need an accommodation and they didn't know how to bring it up. So if that's the case, then right then you're able to correct it together and you move on and you don't end up losing a qualified employee. And that's the goal. Discipline is not about terminating people. It's about stopping an issue before it results in a termination.
So is it accurate to say that if somebody were to be fired, that reason cannot be related to their disability?
That is correct.
Okay. Employee accommodations are always expensive for employers. Fact or fiction?
That is fiction. Most accommodations can be done very simply and with very little cost. The Job Accommodation Network is an online resource that will even help you come up with accommodations. You can reach out to them. It's a free service for employers. And I highly recommend that people utilize their services.
So that sounds like an important step before it would potentially escalate to the point of a legal hearing.
Absolutely.
And so when would you involve Jan? Would you involve them up front, or just if you're struggling with the...
I think it's a great idea that if you are preparing to have this meeting with the employee, that maybe you bring in your laptop and together you look at the website and see what type of accommodations might work for this person. Because sometimes other employers have problem solved already, and they have a lot of solutions that other people haven't considered yet. I gave an example earlier of an employer that simply put blocks under a desk to raise it. I've also seen where files get rearranged so that people can reach it. You know, there are just simple, common sense strategies that can vastly improve the working conditions for people with disabilities.
So you were speaking about the Job Accommodation Network earlier, and I actually found a survey that they did. So this was between 2019 and 2023. 56% of the employers who participated said that they didn't spend any money on the accommodations.
That doesn't surprise me. I think that when you consider the value that every employee brings to the workplace, a small expense is nothing when we talk about retention.
Absolutely. So that officially ends Fact or Fiction. Congratulations. You got through my interview. I am curious, though, before we close out, it's 2025. Is there anything else that you feel like people leaders should be keeping a pulse on when it comes to disability at work?
There have been changes in the requirements relating to websites. And so I would encourage all employers to follow up and see what the ADA is recommending around that topic to make sure that they are compliant.
So any final words of wisdom before we officially wrap up?
I think it's important to remember that we are talking about people first, people with a disability. My father, your grandpa, was in a wheelchair for many, many years, and he truly appreciated when people would see him first as a person.
So this is really about not coming in with assumptions about what someone can or can't do, but really, it sounds like coming in with more curiosity and empathy to see, how you can best support.
Having conversations is very important, and looking at what is the person's ability as opposed to what is their disability.
So on that note, I just want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you, of course, for appearing as an expert in this video. Hopefully this was helpful for everyone, and I'm going to include a short exercise that you can do. This is something that's called roll and tell. So I'll put the instructions up in just a moment. For those who've already seen the first video, you've probably seen this already. Maybe you played it. But if you haven't yet, this would be a great time to have a conversation, not just about disability at work, but also neurodiversity from part 1. If you are interested in getting more resources for people leadership, please make sure to subscribe. You can also learn more about my work at jessiefavor.com. So thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for everyone for tuning in. All right, so to complete this activity, what you'll do is get into teams. I would recommend about 5 to 6 people, and then make sure that you've got a die. Now, if you don't have dice physically, you can look online. If you Google, you'll find virtual dice rollers, and you'll roll the die and then check the number and find the associated question. That is the question that I recommend starting with as a group. Once you've discussed that, then you can roll again. So make sure that you set up an agreed upon amount of time. I would recommend at least 15 or 20 minutes to have a discussion, but please make sure that this is not the end of this conversation. As you all know, ongoing development is so important in this area, and so committing to being a lifelong learner will make all the difference for your team.